Friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 19th of May of 2026. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where these days pro-Ukrainian sources, pro-Ukrainian authorities, and politicals are talking a lot about the situation with the Republic of Belarus and on the territory of the Republic of Belarus. Let's discuss the most important statements that were made during the previous 24 hours. Belarus has restricted access to forests near the borders with Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania. Among the possible scenarios, either threats in Volyn and the Suwalki corridor to force Ukraine to maintain more reserves. Later, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine made another statement on this matter. He said that information about an invasion from Belarus is quite real. According to the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in such a case, the front for Ukraine will become even wider. The Commander-in-Chief noted that the threat from Belarus and mentioned the possibility of an operation in the north. He stated that the Russian General Staff is currently actively planning offensive operations from the north. The question is why pro-Ukrainian sources are talking so much about the Republic of Belarus these days and about a threat from the north. When talking about the threat from the north, pro-Ukrainian sources are talking about possible offensive operation from the border of the Republic of Belarus in the southern direction, in the direction of the city of Kiev, in the direction of the city of Chernobyl, Chernihiv, and so on. So the question is why the Ukrainians are talking so much about this situation. And the most important, another important detail, why all these statements and all these articles were published during the same day when the president of Russia traveled to China. I would like to remind you that today the president of Russian Federation is coming to China, and by the time I started making this video, he had already arrived in China. Tomorrow he's going to have a meeting with Xi Jinping, and it seems that the Russians are planning to have they're planning to discuss and they're planning to negotiate lots of topics with the Chinese counterpart. And all these things about Belarus, about possible offensive from the north, were made by the Ukrainians today. Another important thing is that, according to the Financial Times, Putin may be considering much broader territorial goals in the war against Ukraine, including potential ambitions towards Kiev and Odessa. The Kremlin's ultimate goals go beyond the current front line, and there is a belief in Moscow that Ukraine's resistance may gradually weaken under the pressure of the war. Although publicly the Russian leadership is focusing on capturing Donbas, Financial Times source claimed that private discussions may include a much broader geographical horizon up to central and southern Ukraine. In particular, they are talking about potential claims to strategically important regions, including access to the Black Sea and key logistical hubs. Putin's real ambitions are likely to be consolidate dominance over Ukraine, at least along the entire Dnieper, the river of Dnieper, which would include capturing Kiev and the key Black Sea port of Odessa. This article was published today, also with the statements from the Ukrainian side and with the travel of Putin in the direction of China, because the Russians have approached the final line of the Donbas arc operation. The Russians are just at just 10 kilometers from the south to the final battle. The Russians are just 12 kilometers to the east of the final battle, and the Russians are just 14 kilometers or 15 kilometers from the north. So one thing is clear, that the final battle for the Donbas arc operation has already started or will start within the next 2, 3, or 4 weeks. And when this battle ends, the Russians will finish everything they were tasked for at the beginning of the special military operation when talking about the territorial issues. The Russians will be able to take under complete control the rest of the Donetsk region and the entire Donbas. And the question is, and the most important issue for Russians, that even if the Russians are able to take all these territories under complete control before autumn, or before December, or before November, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians will accept the reality and that the Ukrainians will accept the situation along the line of combat contact. With the end for the rest of Donetsk, for the rest of the Donbas region, it doesn't mean that the war in Ukraine will finish, at least from the Ukrainian side. And maybe if the Russians want to finish the battle along the current line of combat contact plus the rest of Donbas region, it doesn't mean that Zelensky and the Ukrainians will accept this, which means that this situation will force the Russians to continue war and to continue clashes with the Ukrainians. And the Russians understand that if this is the situation, if this is the case, then the Russians need to start thinking how to force the Ukrainians to accept the reality and how to force the Ukrainians to capitulate. And there are lots of possible solutions, but it seems that according to different experts, according to the Ukrainian intelligence, the Russians are preparing the offensive operation from the north, right after the end of the battle for the rest of Donbas. Oh, probably everybody understands this, but the most important question, what is the connection between these offensives, the situation after the end of the battle for Donbas, and the meeting between Putin and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping? And on this matter, the sources are saying that the president of Russia travels to China with the purpose to have a meeting with Xi Jinping and to get something like approval or an agreement from the Chinese side that China will support Russia after the end of the battle for Donbas. Not just like a political support, but financial support or production support, military support, and so on. The thing is that the most important idea of pro-Ukrainian sources is that the Russians are able to support the current situation, the current line of combat contact from the area of the city of Sumy towards the southwestern parts of the Kherson direction. But if Russians want to begin the northwestern offensive operation, the offensive from the north, in this particular situation, the Russians need a mobilization, or they need somehow to motivate people to sign more contracts, or they need to begin a mobilization, and they need to mobilize probably from 200,000 to 500,000 people for this possible offensive operation from the north. And as of the current situation, as of the current oil prices, probably both the Ukrainians and the Russians understand that the Russians will be able to both support the current line of combat contact and to organize mobilization and to support the second front line. But the problem is that nobody knows for sure for how long the current situation with oil and with the Middle East will last. And this is the most important question, which the president of Russia is going to discuss today or tomorrow with the president of China, Xi Jinping. The Russian president needs support and guarantees that the situation in the Middle East will continue at least for another year or maybe 2 years. And if this situation doesn't continue for this period of time, then the Russians need the support from the Chinese, that they will help the Russians to support their forces, to equip forces, to increase production of drones, artillery shells, artillery rounds, and so on, for the opening of the second front line and for the possible mobilization, which most likely is going to take place if this operation mobilization is going to take place only during September or October or even November of 2026, after the end of elections in the United States of America, midterm elections and parliament elections on the territory of Russia. So these two election campaigns finish, and then Russians will start mobilization process. Of course, if something unpredictable happens, in this particular case, of course, the Russians would be forced to change their plans and so on. So these are the position, and these are the statements of pro-Ukraine Ukrainian sources on this matter. Today, Russians and tomorrow Chinese will try to find an agreement or solution how this war, how this situation can continue if Ukraine doesn't withdraw their troops from the rest of Donbas before the end of the battle for these three cities, Drushkovka, Kramatorsk, and Slaviansk. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground and let's see where exactly the Russians are and what do they need and what are the Russians going to do with the purpose to finish the battle for the rest of the Donbas within the next months, weeks, or something like this. And first, let's talk about the northern directions. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of updates, especially from the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region. And according to information we have, the Russians have improved their position significantly along the river of Volcha. This morning, the group of forces north published this video where we can see how exactly the clashes for the settlement of by the name of Volokhovka were taking place. In this video we can see lots of episodes of how Russian soldiers were moving through the village, and in the final part of this video we can see lots of episodes of how Russians were waving with their Russian flag. There are 3 episodes with the Russian flag. One of them was geolocated in the northwestern part and 2 of them were geolocated through the southern parts of the settlement. Based on this video, we came to the conclusion that indeed the Russians improved their position significantly in this area. The next target for Russians, it seems that the settlement of Karaichne, and probably the clashes are already taking place for this village. The Russians are attacking this territory from at least 2 directions, from the west and from the east, and most likely in coming days we'll receive additional changes and additional reports about the situation in this area.
Se med, når det sker. Ingen plads til fejl.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainians began their own counter-offensive operation in the area to the west of the settlement of Belый Kolodец. We're talking about these territories along the river of Seversky Donets. The Ukrainians realized that now they need to counter-attack with the purpose to stabilize the situation, because during the previous months the Russians managed to improve their position significantly, and the Russians, which is the most important thing, managed to outflank the settlement of Belый Kolodец. And during the April of 2026 we had reports that the clashes were taking place already for the villages of Sosnovy Bor, Losovka, and the settlement of Shesterivka. So, which means that if the Russians were able to establish complete control over these territories during the late or middle spring military campaign, so during the April of 2026, then of course from these positions the Russians would be able to continue their offensive operation further in the eastern direction with the purpose to attack the settlement of Belый Kolodец from behind. When the Ukrainians realized this situation, they redeployed additional and fresh forces in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region, and the Ukrainians began their counterattacks in this area. The first counterattack took place along the border between Russia and Ukraine, and as a result of this counter-offensive operation, the Ukrainians managed to recapture the settlement of Odradne. We had this report several days ago, more precisely on the 15th of May of 2026. Pro-Ukrainian sources published this video where we can see how several Ukrainians were entering the settlement of Odradne and how Ukrainians raised their flag. And at the same time, the Ukrainians began a counter-offensive operation in the direction of this pocket with the purpose to stabilize the situation and to force the Russians to fall back from this area. And these days, we start receiving lots of updates on this matter from this direction. And these are the changes on the ground between the dates. So this is the end of the 16th of May of 2026. By the end of the 17th of May of 2026, we received reports that Ukrainians launched a counter-offensive operation in this area with the purpose probably to cut this pocket. And by the end of the 19th of May, we have at least several videos published by pro-Russian sources from the villages of Liman, Cegelny, and Sinelnikovo. And in this video, we can see how Russians of 82nd Motor Rifle Regiment were attacking positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in this area. Lots of episodes were published and two of them were geolocated. One of the attacks took place right exactly at this point and one of the attacks took place right exactly at this point. Based on these two videos, we have added a gray zone. We believe that the Ukrainians managed to infiltrate further and deeper in the northern direction. Now the Russians are trying to secure the area, but at the same time the Ukrainians continue their counter-offensive with the purpose to cut these Semyonovka pockets and to force the Russians to fall back. So the Kharkiv momentum, the Kharkiv offensive operation or counter-offensive operation from the Ukrainian side is gaining momentum.
Frie fejrer jubilæum, men gaven, den er til dig. Lige nu får du nemlig også et gavekort på 750 kroner, når du melder dig ind. Se tilbud og vilkår på frie.dk.
Now let's move further and let's talk about the Slaviansk-Konstantinovka direction. As we discussed, the Russians are just in 15 kilometers from the north, in 13 kilometers from the east, and in 11 kilometers from the south, which means that the Slaviansk-Konstantinovka agglomeration was caught by the Russians in pincers, and every single day the Russians are getting closer and closer to the final battle of the Donbas arc operation. As of the previous 24 hours, the changes were recorded to the east of the city of Slaviansk. The Russians continue an offensive operation. They're bombing and attacking the cities of Nikolaevka, the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine further to the east. Furthermore, we had report that the Russians this day increased their activities, intensified their offensive operation to the east of the city of Kramatorsk. It seems that the Russians are planning to take under complete control these three cities, but first the Russians, it seems that are planning to cut this territory into two pieces. So let's say the northern Slaviansk direction and the southern Drushkovka direction. And then the Russians would try to handle with every single piece separately. As of the previous 24 hours, we received lots of videos from the city of Kramatorsk, and in this video we can see the city that, as you can see, wasn't significantly damaged since the beginning of the special operation. We see that the buildings basically aren't damaged at all. There are lots of vehicles, civilian vehicles and so on. And in this video we can see how Russians were flying through the streets and buildings of the city of Kramatorsk, attacking vehicles that the Russians believed belonged to the armed forces of Ukraine. So the Russians are trying to establish something like a kill zone through the city, trying to attack and destroy vehicles of the armed forces of Ukraine. So this is the situation in this area, and as we discussed, we have significant changes. As for the Konstantinovka direction, it seems that the Russians very soon will finish the battle for the city. We're not talking about days and hours, obviously, but probably 2-3 weeks, and the map will be significantly changed and differ from the map that you can see right now in front of your screens. The Russians continue advancing. It seems that the southern and the southwestern parts of the city have already collapsed. The Russians, according to different sources, managed to encircle the Ukrainians in the most southern micro-district of the city by the name of Promyslovy, and the Russians, it seems, managed to improve their positions and also to encircle the Ukrainians between the settlements of Podolsk and Chervone. So it seems that the front line in this area is crumbling, and the Russians are intensifying their offensive with the purpose to get as close as possible to the city of Alexeyevka-Drushkovka from the south and from the southeast.
Hos Normal kan du tage 3 Vanish for prisen på 3 Vanish.
As for the Dobropolye direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. Probably the most important thing is that the Russians consider to attack the city of Dobropolye from the village of Donbas towards its northeastern part. So it seems that this is exactly what the Russians are planning to do, with the purpose to establish complete control over the city of Dobropolye. These days we received lots of videos from this area of how Russians were bombing and attacking positions of the armed forces of Ukraine, preparing this foothold before further offensive operation. In this video we can see how positions of the armed forces of Ukraine were bombed through this territory. As you can see, there is something like suburbs of the city of Dobropolye, something like dachas, and these are buildings, and as you can see, these dachas start here and they end somewhere here, which means that the Russians, under the cover of tree lines, buildings, constructions and basements, are able to move further in the northwestern direction, and using these roads of attacks, the Russians would be able to answer the northeastern parts of the Dobropolye agglomeration. And basically with this offensive operation, the Russians are able to cut the most northeastern parts of the settlement and to cut TO514 road that connects the city of Dobropolye with the Kramatorsk-Slaviansk agglomeration. So it seems that this is exactly what the Russians are trying to probably develop right now. As of now, we don't have a lot of updates on this matter, just small videos and updates, but all these small videos and updates are telling us that this is most likely exactly what the Russians are trying to develop right now. As for the Zaporozhye direction, these days the clashes between the Russians and the Ukrainians intensified significantly. The Russians intensified the bombardments of the city of Orekhov and the Orekhov agglomeration. This is the last, more or less, biggest stronghold in front of rights between the Russia's positions and the city of Zaporozhye. And of course, if Ukrainians lose the city, obviously it will become much more easier for Russians to advance further in the northwestern direction. Furthermore, the Russians, it seems that it seems that stronghold in front of rights between the Russia's positions and the city of Zaporozhye. And of course, if Ukrainians lose the city, obviously it will become much more easier for Russians to advance further in the northwestern direction. Furthermore, the Russians, it seems that